everybody. Professor Snart checking in again. I know it's been a while. I was out of town at a conference and then have just been basically playing catch up ever since. It seems like student conferences and other classes and, you know, the usual load of stuff going on. So we have, let's see, finished up our kind of that capstone project then, the group or partner project for the short fiction piece of our Intro to Lit course. I think they turned out great on the whole. You can go into Unit 6 and take a look at all of them. Some people did slide shows. Some people did websites. I wish I could like embed the website so it would show up. It looks cooler than just a link, but obviously it takes you to the right place. You can see the slideshows right here and kind of click through them. Love this picture here. That's really cool. So lots of really good comparisons. If there was a weakness that I noticed, and again, I use that term really loosely here, it's that especially when you're doing a comparison, you want to be conscious of keeping the comparison kind of at the forefront for your reader or viewer or whatever. In other words, if we do a slideshow, we don't want, so let's see how long this one, like let's call it 10, right? I don't want 5 slides of just the one story and then 5 slides of the other story, or kind of like pieced out like that. So it seems like 2 mini slide presentations or mini essays, mini discussions. We really want, almost like is going on here, visually, textually, whatever you're building into the presentation, both stories remaining kind of at the forefront for our readers. So lots of people actually use design features like basically like a column setup, a little bit like what's going on here. I just happened to click into it, where we have a theme and then maybe a discussion with quotes. In this case, we have that visual representation. So the idea of comparison is always right in front of us. Again, if there was something I noticed that in some cases we sort of lost that aspect of comparison. And sometimes this happens, you know, who knows if this was the case, is that especially in group work where we parcel out who's going to do what, if it ends up being like a comparison and we say, okay, you do cathedral and I'll do yellow wallpaper, you know, it kind of defeats the point of working as a group to compare. So you might have a boatload of info on cathedral. I might know a lot about yellow wallpaper, but as a team, we don't really have that comprehensive knowledge. And so sometimes that can produce like a slideshow, website, essay, whatever, where all of the stuff about one is kind of lumped together and then all of the stuff about the other text is lumped together. Again, lots of people had really creative organization where we were kind of talking about ideas that linked them both rather than 2 separate discussions. And I think the strength of the projects here kind of across the board is the quality of the analysis, I guess, or the depth of the analysis. I felt like even where people might start with a general kind of a visual effect going on here, there was always a really great level of discussion, not just of thematic connection, but with really specific use of quotation and kind of drawing those connections in a really, really tight way from text to text, not just big, you know, themes. Another thing to think about, and it's like, this is an interesting thing generally, I'd be interested to hear what you guys have to say, is that as we get more into the sort of 21st century mode of getting away from the traditional just individual text essay that you produce and more into what we call multimodal presentations, where you're developing things that depend on visual, audio, actual video itself, sometimes that you find, sometimes that you create yourself. If that now becomes part of like a composition course or any kind of analysis course like ours, where you're asked to compose things, to what degree do we now have to be conscious of basic principles of graphic design? And I feel like that's really where, if some of you become teachers, that's where you'll have to begin to train students in a kind of graphic design capacity, so we're not overusing visuals, like we clutter a page or complicate a page. This one, right, nice and clean, but sometimes our impulse to get a little bit too busy on individual pages ends up with a lot of clutter. It's like the web itself. We have so much, we kind of have nothing sometimes. So again, you know, every once in a while I would see a page where people just sort of got a little over ambitious, I might say. But it's not like something we cover as course content. So is it really my place then to say, oh, this is bad graphic design? For those of you who worked in the new Google Site Builder or the Weebly Builder, and you'll notice these two are very similar now, you can tell that what Google Sites and what Weebly as web builders do is really take all of the graphic design challenge out of it for you. Like, there's very limited options when it comes to building these sites. That's why they all start to look the same after a while. Whereas the older kinds of site builders, which I think is what this group used, you'll notice that it looks very different. And in fact, kind of ironically, there's more creative opportunity in the old builder, because precisely what the new builder tries to do is make every website kind of like graphic design compliant, if you want to call it that. So anyway, I think really successful. Hopefully you felt successful working with a group, right? A partner online. Again, we did a lot of setup to make sure people were just able to basically communicate effectively before we launched into the work itself. And I think we all know that the jobs that you guys will eventually have, the careers that you'll have, it's very unlikely that you'll show up to work and be told to do something completely on your own that never gets looked at by anybody else. Like, that really doesn't even exist. Or if it does, it's like a menial entry-level position where you're just kind of churning out form after form, or whatever the case might be. Certainly not the kind of career that most of us would hope to have. I know I spend most of my time, even on my latest book project, for example, it was a co-authored book where we used Google Docs to like write it in real time with each other. It was a different experience from my earliest writing at the graduate level, for example, but it's pretty cool, honestly. So I think working in groups like we've done here is, as you guys know, becoming more common in terms of what you do as a student, but it's really also gearing you to the kind of career, the kind of job that most people would like to have, where you have, it's kind of goal or task oriented. You work with others in a creative, collaborative way. It's not just you producing some isolated product that never goes anywhere else. So yeah, we learn about kind of literature through what we do, but we also learn some pretty basic and pretty important 21st century collaboration and multimodal composing skills. And I think they turned out great. Hopefully you feel proud of them too. And they can be done online. Haha. Okay, which brings us to, let's see. So Unit 7, right? Into poetry. So we've just finished up, that. We have the reply feature using more the traditional discussion board. Now we move to our next genre for our intro to lit, which is poetry. We have a couple of units devoted to that. We run into spring break, and then we finish up with drama. Okay, so our first poetry unit, I think, is a really cool one. He says, having invented it. Okay, that sounded bad, but you get it. So we have the usual, quick reading assignment from our course. It's interesting to note that we start here with a hip-hop artist published in our Intro to Lit book, called a poem called Hip Hop by Mos Def. Not a video exactly, but the audio with some video background is here for you to listen to. Mos Def is, I'm not a hip-hop guy really, but it's absolutely one of my favorite performers. He's so kind of inventive, I'd like to say. Okay, so the point though is that our introduction into poetry is not really let's study some poetry from the textbook, which is kind of, again, the traditional way to do it. Poetry is this weird thing that exists just in English textbooks. So we crack the book, we open the poem, we write our whatever essay about it, we close the book, and then we forget about it. That's totally not how we want to get into poetry here. So our first thing to do with poetry is actually to bust that wide open and find out where it is everywhere in our lives. So in the form of lyrics would be an obvious case. But we're going to go even kind of broader than that. So we have a Padlet, a tool that we've used in our course. In this case, again, in the truly mobile sense, to have you out there in the world kind of looking at things or looking for things. And we're going to try to find poetry, or quote-unquote poetry, anywhere and everywhere. So like the text here suggests, it has this weird, very central role in our culture, but also very marginal. It has lots of baggage attached to it, some negative, some positive, usually a mix of those things. But we want to discover poetry out there in the world, hiding in plain sight. And I bet you there's more of it than you ever realized. Look at a billboard or magazine advertisement or anything like that. And it's fundamentally, I'll bet, poetry. It arranges words in space on a page or like a thing, a visual field that we look at. And so the words matter, but also the spacing of those words. And often with poetry, we find that less is more, or the use of white space almost makes it a visual art as much as just that text art that we read like we would read a short story. Okay, so your job is to be on the lookout and use our poetry Padlet. I'll text this out so you've got it on your phone, to post some pictures of poetry in the real world. So that means poetry, literally poetry, has to be words, not just something kind of poetic in some really generic sense, like a beautiful thing that you see or some person that you really like or some event you like attending. So we don't want to take poetry and just make it mean everything. That sort of defeats the purpose. On the other end, though, we don't just want to pull our textbook, right, open or off the shelf or pull it up on the screen and take a picture of that and be like, hey, look, poetry. Well, we kind of already know that poetry exists there. It's where else does it exist that we want to discover it. So it's not that it can mean anything, right? And it's not just that traditional existence that we want to find. It's somewhere in the middle. And if you're creative about this and have a careful eye, I bet you'll discover poetry in lots of amazing places. And again, it might not be there presenting itself as poetry per se, but if you look at it, it wants to be read as poetry, as like the intense use of language to communicate meaning. And again, it has that visual aspect that we see. So it's not just lines of text like in a paragraph or a short story that we might run into. Okay, so I like this as our first thing to do with poetry, not just to bury ourselves in the textbook and do sort of that traditional old thing that we're used to. There's a reply function set up, so you'll notice we kind of do this using the discussion board to do the reply piece, but the Padlet is our fundamental work that we're doing here. As always, make sure that you include your name in the post on the Padlet, again, for grading and response purposes. Yeah, that saves us from having to like have a Padlet account and sign in and do all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to text this out right away, so you'll get this pretty soon. And I hope you have fun discovering poetry in all those places that we don't usually look for it, hiding in plain sight.